how can companies make a work experience more rewarding, right? We may all think as bosses that we provide great deal of satisfaction personally, professionally, and the like, but when you're doing things virtually, A, and B, you see a lot of competition in the labor market, you're sort of rubbing your head going, well, I'm offering high wages and they're still not taking the jobs. So I think we've got to be imaginative about how we attract workers. They can't sit at home forever, right? But the competition among buyers of workers, the companies, is whoever becomes most innovative in trying to attract a certain part of the labor force is going to win. And to be honest, I don't see a lot of CEOs being as imaginative as they should be. I think a lot of them are still believing, this is a transition, this will pass. It ain't going to pass. It's not going to pass. And I think the more that companies can get with it, and maybe look at how companies are dealing with problems like this even prior to COVID in other countries, like in Europe. Now, the COVID has really jostled us. It's really jostled us, whether it's in terms of real estate, how close do we want to be to the office, time in the car. Now, my view is that this is what I meant in the very beginning about distinguishing between cyclical change and secular changes. And just as policymakers got to make that distinction, so too do CEOs. And I don't think enough CEOs, frankly, have come to grips with it. It's not a criticism, it's an observation. And it's not an easy problem to solve, but it's a very real problem. Being on the Fed board is not an easy job. I think their track record has been actually quite good. And I think the question is that we've got it. It's not going to be, what's going to happen in the United States is not going to be done in isolation, what happens in other countries. And you can be sure, which is why I mentioned in the very beginning about the banking crisis in 2007, 2008, you can be sure that the Fed is coordinating daily, if not multiple on a daily basis, with other central banks around the world. So I think it's going to take some time. But it's a bizarre economy where you've got a lot of countervailing forces at the same point in time, which is at least in my lifetime, it's a very unique combination. But does that mean as a policymaker you sit back and say, that's perplexing. Let's see how this plays out. So you got to figure out which tools do you use, how agile can you be, and most importantly, and this where the Fed does not do this, sometimes not as good as they should, you've got to explain to the public why it is that you're doing what you're doing. And Ben Bernanke actually did a pretty good job. The Treasury at that point did a pretty good job. I don't want to make a comment on the current Fed chair, but that to me, if you're going to be in the policy-making job as an economist in Washington or London or wherever you are, it's not just a question of changing policy. You got to explain it. You got to explain it to the consumers, to the investors, to the across the board. And that's very unusual for economists to actually get up and grab a microphone and communicate why we're doing something. And usually it's retrospectively, right? To me, that's the biggest challenge in economic policy making, is articulating why you're doing what you're doing and mentioning perhaps what you're looking for in terms of road signs as you go down over time, where, well, if we see X, Y, and Z, we're going to then reconsider or we'll move in a different direction. Because you have to instill confidence. Our economies is as only good as the confidence that the regulators and the public policy makers generate. And that's in short supply. It's in short supply in Washington and a lot of other places. And I've spent many, many years going through state-owned enterprise after state-owned enterprise in China when I was running a large part of the World Bank's financial program in China on the ground. And, China, in my view, does not have a long way to go before there really is a fundamental breakdown. And let me tell you why. The easiest way to think about it from my perspective is they have, and Xi Jinping clearly celebrates this, the model is a socialist market economy. Now, if you think about those words, socialist market economy, I don't know about you, but to me that's a contradiction in terms. And so they want to have their cake and eat it too. Now, what's been lucky for the Chinese is that for the last 15 years, because they're so large, they've been able to ride that bicycle without falling off. But if you've looked at the most recent GDP numbers, certainly in the last year, but certainly in the last quarter, they've begun to go to the lowest levels probably in about 15 years or so. This worries Beijing an incredible amount. Worse than that, during the third-party Congress, which took place last month when Xi Jinping was elected, in quotes, to his third fifth-year term as the leader of the party, you actually saw demonstrations, now relatively small, demonstrations on highways in Beijing. I never saw that in my time in China. And just yesterday, because of China's 100% COVID crackdown, there was another demonstration. Now, we live in the United States, we see demonstrations a lot. In China, this is really unheard of. But for an economist looking at emerging markets, and China in particular, this is an incredible barometric indicator that something is amiss in China. And another indication of this socialist market economy contradiction, and a couple of years ago in one of China's stock markets, I should put the quotes on markets, not stock markets, you may remember there was a downdraft in the prices. Now, I put quotes on markets because these are not real markets in the sense that you and I would think of a market. And a lot of these bets that were made in Chinese stock markets, and I'm not trying to be snide about grandmothers, but a lot of it was grandmothers putting money down on particular companies that their friends said, oh, let's put some money on this. There's not a lot of market of education about how to make investments in China. And what happened was prices dropped. And the grandmothers went nuts. And a lot of people lost a lot of money. What did Xi Jinping do? He comes in and bails them out because he was afraid of social instability. That is what is most fearful for the Chinese leadership, is social instability. There's a problem. When you start bailing out investors on investments that they made of their own free will, you got to allow for some downside risk. But when you come in and you bail out downside risk, you create what economists call a moral hazard. You're essentially giving them an inducement to say, I'll invest again, and if I don't make some money, the government will come in. That's exactly the kind of contradiction and dilemma how Beijing is governing the country. And I just don't see that being a model for continued growth and prosperity. And what I think is illustrative of my point about separating cyclical challenges from secular challenges is how supply chains entered the lexicon. It entered the lexicon not because of China, but because of COVID. All of a sudden we realize, well, why aren't my things coming to the stores? And why are the shelves empty? People say, supply chain. It's like a secret religion. And the problem is that people don't, and not that they should, understand actually how supply chains work. But COVID really masked, in my view, the underlying challenges that were already underway in the logistics and supply chain sector. And one of the challenges is we don't do a great job in many of our ports, and then frankly in many of our logistics companies, of marrying advanced technology at the rate that we should in the logistics sector, whether it's artificial intelligence, digitalization, and the like. You go to a port in China, we can talk about the labor issue in a second, but you will find extraordinarily modern logistics outfits and companies. Now, we're beginning to catch up. I mention that because that lack of the use of technology and logistics exacerbated what we were experiencing during the pandemic. But it's a classic problem that economists see is confusing causation with correlation. And now that the pandemic hopefully is receding, we're left with, I think, a lot of challenges in the logistics sector. And one of those, in my view, and I've written a couple of Forbes columns on this, is the pricing that the customer pays for shipments of goods. The end price does not represent the real value and the cost of getting products to the home or to the office, wherever it is that you're taking delivery. What do I mean by that? We've become very spoiled, frankly, those of us who use Amazon or even other companies. We want things that, as we know, are just in time, right? But are we paying a high enough price for just-in-time delivery? Most of us who don't understand supply chains think, Amazon's got it at the factory. They can just put it on a truck and it's here. Well, what's in the Amazon warehouse was built and delivered months ago. But the rapidity with which that happens, the rapidity and the way the various components come about to make a good, all depend on what the price signals are being transmitted through the chain, up towards the supply. And most people think that when you buy a product made in China, that the actual entire product is made in China. No. There are tiered supply chains, right? What something might come from Amazon that says this was manufactured in China, one component may be from China, then it's a component from Thailand is hived on that, it's shipped to Brazil, and another component, and then it comes to the US or European markets. And so the question is, how much are we actually using price effects in order to deal with demand and supply mismatches? How much would you be willing to absorb a price discount for time delay? I mean, when I gave a speech 2 weeks ago in Chattanooga at a big FreightWaves conference about this, which is, I don't see many companies, at least at the retail end, and frankly, I think even prior to the retail end, having enough price discrimination between speed of delivery. Usually where the crunch comes in is the quantity stops because we just can't get it. But if there was a high enough price, lo and behold, you'd figure out a way of paying workers more to develop things. But is the spread of prices between just in time versus just in case wide enough? I don't think so. And I think we'd all be willing to accept a discount, or we'd be willing to pay a higher price if that was calibrated towards the speed of delivery. And this is obviously very important for this local economy because of the prominence of the port. And I think most people don't understand, probably not in this room, but outside this room don't understand that there's interport competition, right? And we've begun to witness this in this country for the first time, for the common person to see, these ships were offshore in Long Beach and Los Angeles, and then it migrated to Houston, or up to Oakland, and then it migrated to the ports in this area. And people were thinking, this is just a one-time phenomenon from COVID. It's not. This game of whack-a-mole, which is what it is actually part and parcel of what should be a competitive part of the supply chain. But if prices are right, you should not be seeing this congestion, right? But prices are not fluid enough, and we in the United States have not put enough in making sure that we have the policies that govern our logistics industry. And I'll tell you, one of the examples of this takes place in India. In India, the east coast of India, many of the ports there, which take goods coming in from China and countries to its east, cannot be offloaded in India's ports on the East Coast. You know why? The ports are not deep enough. You know why they're not deep enough? Because the labor unions don't want to dredge them. They don't want to have super ships come in, because that decreases the jobs. So what happens in India, and I think there's a parable here for the US, 30% of ships, cargo coming into the eastern side of India is transshipped through Sri Lanka. I mean, it's really quite inefficient. So there's a time delay, there's a price difference, and when people begin to see this in India, and I've done some work for this on them, they said, you know, I'm not anti-union, but we got to figure this out. If we want an economy that works, this is what I mentioned at the very top. I'm optimistic if you have the right kind of policy. We got to get our hands around this. You know, that you can't modernize ports by digging deep ports is really quite incredulous. And frankly, even the Prime Minister Modi is in on this. So it's a complicated country. It's not the same as the US, but it's an illustrative example of the importance of how interport competition is important, is what's going on with Russia from an economic perspective. When the war broke out in Ukraine, probably about 3 months into it, when we, maybe almost a year into it, when we imposed sanctions on Russia. And by the way, the sanctions that the US and the European Union and the Japanese and others put together for Russia was unprecedented in coordination. Usually economic sanctions do not work for a whole set of reasons, and there's leakage. These sanctions actually were put together very well, but the problem is that people are worried that with the war in Russia, by Russians in Ukraine, this is going to mean the end of globalization. So you saw a lot of highbrow articles by colleagues of mine meaning this is the end of globalization. Well, the fact of the matter is that Russia's economy is puny. It's really small. And the notion that if Russia falls by the wayside, that's the end of globalization is far-fetched. That's neither good news nor bad news, but it's a lot of misinformation and misperceptions of how the world economy is structured. And so this is why you saw, pretty much at the outbreak of the war and the sanctions, you saw a lot of US companies and a lot of EU companies pull out of Russia. They did that relatively quick. You know why? Because they realized the opportunity cost of not being in that economy was not very large. Now, I happen to think, having worked in Russia almost as long as I worked in China, it's a little bit larger than most people think, because the Russians and many people in emerging markets have really good memories. You pull out of a market today and then you say, we want to come back in 6 years from now. You've signaled on the margin some degree of unreliability and loyalty, as they say. So you got to make that calculation, you know, quite carefully. But I do think there's a lot of overstatement about the importance of what Russia is doing to unwinding globalization. China is the issue for globalization, and how the G7, the advanced democracies, you know, are buying and selling and using China as a supply chain node. That's where, you know, where globalization's history is going to be written. Important.